Good morning, good afternoon, and also good evening, and welcome to our monthly webinar series at Historical Trauma and Transformation. My name is Melike Fourie, and I will be your host. So today's session is a follow-up from our April webinar, which was the official launch of the book Post-Conflict Hauntings, Transforming Memories of Historical Trauma. This is an edited volume that deals with the haunting power of histories of mass violence. But the book also deals with different attempts to rebuild political structures and shape social relationships in the hope of creating more peaceful futures. And it is this latter aspect that today's webinar will be focusing on. Specifically, today's webinar creates space for some of the chapter authors to present their work in relation to the theme of collective healing. As always, we are delighted to have such an international audience join us again today. Many of you are also from the countries featured in this edited volume. A warm welcome again to you all. And if you want to, please feel free to introduce yourselves using the chat function, both to us and to each other. Okay, so while people are announcing themselves, I want to reiterate that our webinars run on the second Wednesday of every month. So the next webinar will be on the 9th of June. This is an exciting panel discussion on the theme of disrupting Stellenbosch and processes of visual redress on our campus here. A full recording of today's event will also be available on our website in a week's time. So just to recap about this book we are talking about today, it is edited by Kim Wale, who is Senior Researcher at Historical Trauma and Transformation here at Stellenbosch University, and Kim is also with us today. The second editor is Phumla Gobodo-Madikizela, Professor in the Faculty of Arts and Social Sciences at Stellenbosch University and also Head of Historical Trauma and Transformation. And then the third editor is Jeffrey Prager, a research professor at the University of California, Los Angeles. So with us today, we have 4 panelists from no less than 4 different countries who will speak to forms of healing that are collective, embodied and grounded in local cultural practices of healing, such as, but not limited to, Aboriginal culture and healing practice, the healing power of bone memory and reburial in Zimbabwe, and sociotherapy in Rwanda. So these contributions explore alternatives to the traditional psychoanalytic mode of trauma work that unfolds between an individual client and a psychotherapist. The hope here is to think through new possibilities for collective repair in context of historical trauma. So I have great pleasure in handing over to Kim now, who will introduce our speakers and facilitate the discussion today. Just one last thing before I hand over to Kim, I want to encourage you as the audience to already post your questions during the panel discussion using the Q&A function. We should have at least 20 minutes towards the end to engage with these questions from the floor. So with that, over to you, Kim. I look forward to it.
Thank you so much, Melike, for that wonderful introduction and for describing so clearly the reason that we chose these 3 chapters today. So as you mentioned, that it's a follow-up webinar from our launch of the book Post-Conflict Hauntings, edited by Phumla and Jeff and myself, who you introduced, and or who you introduced earlier, and the 4 panelists with us today all contributed chapters to the book, and their chapters were very striking in the sense that they are also based on their work as practitioners in the field, doing this work of working with and through trauma in very creative ways and collective ways, in ways that are culturally relevant, and in 3 different contexts, 3 different global contexts. So I thought it was a fantastic opportunity to bring them here to speak about that work, and also the questions that arise around what it means to do this kind of complicated and difficult work, and the insights that they've found along the way. So I'm very grateful to the 4 of you for being here today, it's not always easy with connection troubles, and the fact that we're connecting from these 4 different corners of the world is quite phenomenal. So thank you so much for being here. So I would like to present our first presenter, Shari Eppel. Shari is Director of Ukuthula Trust in Bulawayo, Zimbabwe. She is completing her doctorate in anthropology at the University of Cape Town, while also training an exhumation team in Zimbabwe. And she has been involved in exhumations and reburials in the past, and she wrote on this process in the book. The team that she's training will be exhuming victims of the Ukuthula massacres in alliance with Zimbabwe's National Peace and Reconciliation Commission. And Shari has been connected to our unit for a while. She's presented at a few of our different conferences over the years. I know she presented with us in Rwanda when we did a conference in 2018 on the haunting power of the past. And again in our conference in Stellenbosch in 2019. And we are so delighted to have you here again to speak about your work. And I'm looking forward to the presentation. Thank you, Shari.
Thanks very much, Kim. It's a real pleasure to be part of this audience and to see some old faces I haven't seen for a long time. So without further ado, what I'm going to do is share the screen so that I can show a PowerPoint. So I'm going to do that right now. Right, okay. Okay, so I started out as a clinical psychologist, and I'm now a forensic anthropologist with a formal training and qualifications in forensic anthropology. And this is partly a little bit of a story about why that happened. And for me, what I found is that material objects, you know, bones, which are extremely powerful and evocative, but also objects from graves, from the past, from the dead, can really bring back memory for families and traumatized communities. And this jersey is an example. It's a national parks jersey, which we'd been told by the son of Julius Mvula-Nyati he'd given to his father 3 weeks prior to him being killed by 5th Brigade in 1984. And I'll never forget how he called out when he saw this jersey being uncovered in the grave. You know, it was this real important reuniting with something important for him. Okay, a few comments on images. Families have given me full permission for their use. They want the narratives of what happened to their relatives to be known, but in a, I would say, in a responsible way. So please don't screen grab images in case they end up on, you know, the WhatsApps and, you know, whatever else of people who might have sort of different agendas to that of the family. Okay, this just to very, very quickly, this is going to be the quickest history ever. During the War of Liberation in the 1970s, there were 2 guerrilla armies which fought for independence, Zanla and Zipra. And by the end of the war, Zipra was mainly supported by the Ndebele speakers in the west of the country, although it must be said not exclusively, and Zanla by the rest of the country. And there were rivalries and tensions left from that, which resulted to Robert Mugabe, our first prime minister, he was back then, training a special brigade called the 5th Brigade, the Ukuthula Brigade, and they were trained by the North Koreans. You can see a North Korean trainer there. And Ukuthula means the first rain of spring, which washes away the rubbish from the last season. And the Ndebele came to see themselves as the rubbish that had to be washed away. Okay, so in 1983, there were massacres to the north of Bulawayo, 1984 to the south, and in 1985, which was the first post-independence election, enforced disappearances. And this was all kind of restricted to Ndebele-speaking regions. Right, my chapter in the book is called How Shall We Talk of Balagwi, Remembering the Ukuthula Era in Matabiland, Zimbabwe. And in terms of an update, to date, there are still no memorials to those massacred by the 5th Brigade, which number between 10 and 20,000. No sanctioned exhumations and no real space to publicly remember and talk. Although, you know, we keep getting told that, you know, you can talk, but in actuality, it's still a very, very difficult thing to do. This is just me reflecting some of my positions, which I've come to over 25 years of doing this work, is that I think that it can be helpful to think of trauma as collective, spatial and material, not just individual. This also helps if you look at localized models of belief, ritual and understanding, essential to working with trauma in each context. So basically, I stopped being a psychologist who believed in post-traumatic stress disorder as the most important thing. I think it still exists, it's still an issue, but what I realized was that trauma was being expressed differently in our region, and I had lots of stories of the angry dead, of bones in the forest, of haunted landscapes, and other spatial and material hauntings and traumas. I think it's also important to realize that political activism may be part of healing, that, for example, I mean, if you think of Black Lives Matter or Me Too, I mean, these are movements which have, you know, people in the West have come to understand as being a way of empowering victims and helping them to move on. And I think around the world, and especially when you've had mass trauma of entire communities, we shouldn't think that one-on-one healing is the way to go, because it's simply impossible when you're talking about thousands or millions of people. What I've also noted is that physical spaces, material objects, and political activism have contributed to making memories of violence tangible in Matabeleland, where I live. To come to Bulawayo camp itself, there is a photo I just grabbed out of a book this morning. That is what Bulawayo camp looked like. That's a Surveyor General's aerial photograph in 1982. Each of those little rectangles is a barracks, asbestos round, you know, one of these circular barracks. And between A and D there on the ground, you can see jeeps, you can see soldiers. So that's just to give you an idea of how enormous this camp was. And it was used in 1984 as a torture base by 5th Brigade. And this is what Bulawayo looks like now. Okay, all of that is gone. And for me, I find it highly symbolic, because it's what our state has tried to do with the Holger Krohindi era, which is to act as if it has never existed and to have no memorials and nothing left to remind themselves or anyone else of what happened. So in the chapter, I talk a bit about Bulawayo and the Battle of the Memorials, where we see intergenerational memory in action, because what I've noticed is that where 25 years ago I was working mainly with parents and siblings of those murdered by 5th Brigade, I'm now working with children and grandchildren. The baton has been passed. And on the 21st of February 2018, which was shortly after the coup which displaced Mugabe, the first ever memorial ceremony was held in Bulawayo camp. And on the 25th of May, the first ever attempt to erect a plaque for victims was made. And there's no photo of this because the plinth was destroyed before it was even completed. The state responded with its own pushback, if you like. And the Department of Public Works built a memorial to the unknown soldier in August 2018. Now, if you consider that it was soldiers who tortured and murdered people at Bulawayo, this was seen as a very aggressive act. And I actually went out just a few weeks later. I wanted to see this for myself. And this is what I found when I got to Bulawayo. Okay, within 2-3 weeks of this unknown soldier tomb being erected, it had been completely destroyed. And what I quite like about this destruction is it was quite ordered. You know, all the bricks were put back on top. You know, even the wreath was put back on top. But this happened like literally in the middle of the night. Just to show you the proximity of that tomb, there are mass graves at Bulawayo, and I know what's in them because we exhumed and buried people there, and that was in 2000. Look at that tomb to the unknown soldier and how close it lies to the victims. So it really was, it would be like commemorating the South African Defence Force 3 meters away from a memorial to the Soweto uprising, to the murders in Soweto. Okay, there was another attempt in February 2019 to put up a victim memorial, and I love this. It was literally done in the middle of the night. You can see the young man who helped build it. His T-shirt says, "I am the dissident that the 5th Brigade was looking for," because the 5th Brigade literally hunted anyone who was in Ndebele and of so-called dissident age. So it's a reminder. And it says here, "In loving memory of our innocent and defenseless children, mothers and fathers who perished during the Krohindi Matabeleland genocide, 83 to 1987, Siele Kombula," which means we remember you. It lasted less than a week. The CIO came and knocked it down. And we see here a tweet from Zenzele Ndebele, who's one of those next generation activists. if Mugabe is to blame for Gukurahundi, why can't we be allowed to create Gukurahundi memorials post the Mugabe era? Which remains a good question. Okay, so exhumations. For me, the power of them is that they allow the right to know and the right to truth. And the failure to do rituals results in dishonoring the dead and in haunted landscapes. And of course, this is not unique to Zimbabwe. In every culture in the world, it's necessary to bury and honor your dead. And one of the things we've heard a lot about in the last, since COVID, is how disruption to funeral practices is really disturbing grieving processes. So it's very much a universal experience. In Matabeleland, victims live in the very landscape of terror. People were tortured in schools, at boreholes, in business centers, and the very rocks and the bones around them provoke memories of past violence. And what I've discovered is that unearthing the murdered dead restores personhood. These three are the sons and one daughter, Sesa, of Julius and Mvulo, whose jersey we saw earlier on. And Sesa was 3, Chris was in his 20s, and then we've got Becky and Moffat. Becky was in his mother's uterus. He was 8 months old and never met his father. Moffat was 8 and was first forced to light the fire on which 5th Brigade burnt his father's feet. That's Julius, the only existing photograph of him, taken when he was a much younger man than when he died. There's Julius. We fully exhumed his remains in 2018. And again, for me, one of the things I'm very aware of is the difference between my gaze, what I call the forensic gaze, and the family gaze. Okay, we see here families, and see how shallow this grave was. You can see Julius's head about 3 inches below Chris's knee there. And this is one of the aunts saying prayers to Julius before we removed the bones from the grave. We then use our forensic skills to come up with a profile, which we try and determine age at death, height at death, and so on. And you can see there a Zimbabwean coin, which also dates the grave. Okay, we then write up forensic reports explaining why we've reached these conclusions. And this is very important. It maintains professionalism and record keeping. We also maintain minimum standards in terms of respect for cultural needs and support. And we archive everything. This is for the future. Information needs to be clear, scientific, simple and safe, and standards can help. You can see there Chris reading the forensic report. Again, I think it's often very comforting and very significant to families to have the material report, which becomes part of the family history. Okay, this is the reburial. We can see there Chris looking at his father's human remains in the coffin. And again, it's open coffins in Zimbabwe, and people want their bones to be seen. We see here Sesa, the sister. She asked me to take this picture of her with her father. She was 3 when he died. She'd never seen his face. And look how she looks like him. I mean, it's astonishing. The chin, the mouth, the nose, the forehead, the hairline. She is just like her father, and she never knew. And she'd never seen this photograph of him until after the exhumation. Because one of the things we find is that photos get hidden. This is the burial. Again, you can see me. I was asked there to explain the perimortem trauma to those watching. I'd already explained it to families before, and then they asked me, please explain again so everyone can understand the evidence of how he died. He was then buried, and in Zimbabwe, you put stones on top of the grave, and then you can see Chris planting a truncheon at the top in the hope it grows into a tree to shade his father's head. This is Daniel, who we also exhumed. Again, this photo of Daniel appeared on the day he was reburied. And you can see here this return of personhood, this reclaiming of memory. The daughter saying she had never seen her father before, although she used to dream about her father a lot. He had no face in her dreams. So the fear is still so huge in Matabeleland, and people don't know how to include these stories in the family narratives. So they tend to disappear them. This is in Kolini, Chilocho, where we did an exhumation in 2019. I don't know if you can see that sort of diagonal line through the top picture. That's a railway line, which you can also see in the back of the following picture. The white spot is where this young couple were killed, and the red spot is where they were buried. And they haunted this railway line and this road for all of these years. And I've heard so many stories from hundreds of people who knew they were buried there and who were very uneasy and were very haunted by their dead. Justin and Tembi, they were a young married couple. They were traveling to try and catch the train out of the area because they were terrified of the soldiers. And you can see Tembi there. She's got the pink dress, actually, on top of her head. And between her legs is a black box. That's actually a radio. Here we can see the family again in the grave saying prayers, all dressed in their best, come for this exhumation. And here are the personal effects. Very moving. There's an umbrella, ambi cream, toothbrush, wristwatch. On the other side is the umbrella. Is the radio being held by the brother, and the sister holding the dress. Recovery of memory. They had a son who was a year old when they died. And he wasn't even told that he was an orphan. He thought the aunt raising him was his mother. And here he is meeting his father for the first time. There he is seeing a photo of his father for the first time. And you can see his uncle saying, "That is your father." He's saying, "Which one is my father?" Because there's 3 men in the picture. And then he actually spoke to his father, and there was this whole interaction. Here are Thembi's remains being explained, trauma being explained. She was actually shot through the head, behind her right ear and out through the face. There I'm laying the bones in anatomical order in the coffin. And again, there's Olani, the son, gazing at his mother's remains. And interestingly for us, here was Olani's son, the grandson of the deceased, who was about 7 years old. And yet his father had decided to include him, very unusually, because normally children are not involved in these sorts of events in our part of the world. But he wanted his son to know the truth that he had never known growing up about what had happened to his grandparents. So here we see transgenerational memory and trauma in action. Laid to rest at last, Justin and Thembi laid in the ground. 2 coffins, 1 grave. You can see the Catholic priest there and also the chief with his brass badge. So just to summarize, for me, remembering is oriented not to the past, but to coming to terms with the past in a present that is continuously troubled by it. And Gakuro Hindi really exemplifies this for me. Current generations in Matabele land have fallen outside of the National Historical Project. Their demands to be heard and to know are living examples of the continuous struggle between dominant and marginal voices in the construction of history and memory. Whose heroes count, whose victims count, and who has a right to decide? Okay, that is the very interesting, very visceral, very physical fight going on at Bulawayo right now. This strange valley in the middle of absolutely nowhere, where people keep knocking down one another's memorials. But for me, what is imperative is to forge a dialogue and allow spaces for victim-driven memories and memorials going forward in order to bring the current generations of Matabele land back into the National Historical Project, where at the moment they really don't feel they are. Okay, so I'm going to stop there. And yeah, I'll leave it there. Thanks very much.
Shari, thank you so much for presenting your work here. It's the depth that you bring to these questions and the way that you take us through them with the images is quite profound and very moving. And it just reminds me again of how the difference between our kind of abstract theorizations of trauma and even the abstract theorizations of trauma being material and memory being material, and what does that really mean? And when I listen to and watch your work, because it's an aesthetic, it's got that material component, it's really a sense of what that really means, the visceral, material and practical realities of haunting in spaces like Zimbabwe, and the healing of the dead, which was on one of the young men's t-shirts in the exhumation. So thank you very much, Shari. I'm going to move on to our second presentation, which will be by Grace and Marianne, and they will be presenting together on their work on sociotherapy in Rwanda, another place of landscapes of terror, Shari, to use your powerful phrase. And I also want to mention that Grace and Marianne co-authored with Annemiek Richters, who can't be present with us here today because she's recovering from an illness, but I know she's in the audience, and I just wanted to mention her participation in this in this powerful work on sociotherapy in Rwanda that they've been doing for many years and that they wrote on for the chapter. So Mari Grace Kagoyire is a PhD candidate in the Faculty of Arts and Social Sciences under the Chair in Historical Trauma and Transformation. So with our unit, I'm proud to say. She is conducting her doctoral research on genocide memory construction among second-generation Rwandan youth. She has extensive individual and group counseling experience working with Rwanda's post-genocide population, as well as with Congolese refugees living in Rwanda, and has conducted training of community mental health workers. And presenting with her is Marianne Vysma, who is a Jungian psychoanalyst and medical anthropologist, as well as a lecturer at Webster University Leiden in the Netherlands in psychodynamic therapy and group processes. Her theoretical interests have focused on how intrapsychic healing requires social connection. In that context, she has participated in various training activities of community-based sociotherapy in Rwanda since 2012, and she is also the co-editor of the book Roads and Boundaries, Travels in Search of Reconnection. Thank you so much, Grace and Marianne. I hand over to you.
Thank you, Kim, for a good introduction. We will present on intergenerational transmission of experiences of collective violence and healing. And the current presentation focuses on the findings of a study that explored the transmission of experiences of collective violence from Rwandan female survivors of the 1994 genocide or rape to their young adult descendants born shortly before or during or after the genocide. The study actually included 12 children, and their mothers had previously completed social therapy sessions. Social therapy is a psychosocial intervention implemented in Rwanda in order to help Rwandans to deal with the consequences of war and the genocide. This study was inspired by the follow-up group discussions we had with the mothers after social therapy and writing their life histories published under the title of Death and Rebirth, Life Histories of Rwandan Female Genocide Survivors. Our presentation is based on account of young people who, in contrast to their mothers, did not join social therapy prior to take part in this qualitative research. We argue that apart from hearing of psychological wounds in the mothers, their participation also regenerated the mother-child healthy bonds. Our focus is on how the young adults we interviewed experienced the transformation of their mother's emotional storms that they could merely endure into stories of experiences between their mothers and their children. We focus on how a healing experience in the survivor generation can, through a recovery of the capacity for relationship, have important intergenerational consequences. But before we talk about hearing, we first share what children shared about how their mothers were before joining and benefiting from social therapy. Children experience their mothers as physically present but emotionally absent, rarely available as caring mothers. They were mostly angry and accusing, displaying fear and anguish when especially they were remembering or re-experiencing violence, and this happened most of the time during annual genocide commemoration, which take place between April and July every year. These violent emotions were present in the family, but they were not talked about. They were not represented in the stories. When children tried to ask their mothers about their experiences during the genocide, mothers mostly responded with silence or resistant to answer, or sometimes provided a few fragmented details. When parents shared their personal experiences, it was often deeply troubling to the children. For instance, some children could experience compulsive thinking, intrusive feelings, disturbances in sleeping, headaches, etc. Others had the feelings of bitterness and abhorrence for those who had committed the violence against their mothers and the difficulties to relate to all groups responsible for genocidal violence. In some other cases, children developed similar problems as their mothers. For instance, when the mother did tell parts of the story, both the mother and the child felt as if it were a re-experience of the violent past, as an emotional experience that overwhelmed their level of understanding. I want to give an example that was shared by Solange, a 21 years old young girl. She said, "When my mother tells me how she struggled to find dry herbs to cover her sister's wounds when they were hiding, I automatically imagine how it was, capturing on the whole picture of how it was raining on them without having any cloth to cover the small children, the newborns. They were together and remember how they three small children against the walls, and I feel as if the genocide is happening now. I suddenly feel as if it is happening now." This shows how also young children also experience what in Rwanda is called the trauma crisis, which are almost similar to the mother's crisis, mostly during the annual genocide commemoration. For children who could not carry the emotional burden, in some instances they stopped asking, or they sometimes avoided to ask more in order to refrain from hurting the mother. Or the mothers also deliberately refrained from sharing in order to protect their own children from the profound horror of the experiences. Mothers were also afraid that sharing the experiences could cause children feelings of revenge. Such reactions among parents caused children to think that parents might hide information. Overall, the mother was often sickly, defensive parent, a mother often on the edge of madness due to the experiencing the traumatic past. Though children had to bear with the silence, they were always on alert for possible emotional storm. And many children developed their strategies to ask again, changed in the family due to hearing of the mother by social therapy. After the mothers were healed through social therapy, the children experienced a different mother, a mother who cares, and a mother who noticed the children. There was the establishment of healthy social relationships, and that enabled children to refine their mothers as mothers, real mothers, because before, when mothers were not able to share their stories, children considered them as immoral mothers. Parents change from moody, volatile, and reclusive people to becoming concerned and involved and interested in the lives of their children, thus allowing children to feel as part of the family. Parents were able to use their agency in what to share or not about their past experiences, how to share it, and to give importance of what they shared. The regenerated mother-child bond enabled the mothers to begin to help their children to walk through the violent experiences that had been shared between them. Let me stop by here and then invite Marianne Vysma to continue. Thank you.
Sorry, my microphone was off. Thank you, Grace. I will now talk about how we try to understand what the children told us about their mothers before and after sociotherapy. As Grace said, we talk about intergenerational transmission of experience. We do this in part because the trauma of the survivor generation is different than the trauma of the second generation. And we also do this in part because, as we hope to show, is that it's not only trauma that can be transmitted intergenerationally, but perhaps also healing. So we organize the transmission of experience based on what the children told us along 4 pathways, which I will now briefly describe. The first one we talked about as the ghost of past violence as a haunting present. It is well known that people who have suffered deeply usually try to hide this suffering. if possible, even from themselves. They need to wall off the experiences of the past in the service of life going on. They are mostly silent about what happened to them, but this silence is not a neutral silence. People do not talk, often because they cannot talk. The experiences cannot be represented, but they often do not talk because they want to protect others from the inner violence that they still feel. They feel almost contaminated by that violence, and they feel they will hurt others. So this is our first conception of how the ghost of the past invades and is haunting the present. The second pathway is that of family violence leading to insecure attachment between the parents and children. So the burden of the mother to care for other people, their children, when she is suffering so deeply herself, is often unbearable. And as Grace showed, the children experienced the overwhelming emotions of anger or anguish that are present in the mother-child relationship, especially in those cases where the child was conceived as a result of rape. And this becomes this overwhelming anger and anguish in the parent-child relationship. Here we use the terminology and the framework of Jessica Benjamin. This becomes a sort of endless doer or done to dynamic. When we look at our research in this framework, we see that, of course, in the original trauma during the genocide, the mothers were the victims of collective violence. They were clearly the done to. But as Grace showed, afterwards, in the family, but before sociotherapy, in the disturbed parent-child interactions, the traumatized mother was often angry or sickly or withdrawn, and as such became the unwilling doer or perpetrator of violence in the family relationship. And it was the children who were the done to, the victims, as Grace showed. We know from other attachment research that such children often grow up wary and fearful and are parenticized children, so they care for their mother. Later again, when the children began to ask the mothers about their experiences during the genocide, the mothers reacted with defensive anger or with anguished re-experiencing, sometimes, as Grace said, revealing parts of the stories. In those interactions, the dynamic was reversed yet again. Here, the children felt like the doer, the perpetrator, the one who caused the pain of the mother by their questioning. So this endless or seemingly endless repetition of the doer done to dynamic, again using Jessica Benjamin's terminology, it is that what we feel results in a very insecure attachment relationship or disturbed relationship between the mothers and the children. The third pathway we call vicarious trauma. And it is this third pathway in which the experience of violence is transferred to defendants. This one comes about when, after sociotherapy, the mother is finally able to tell parts of her story. And this is the story, or this is what Grace showed in the quote around Solange. And what we see here is that the children do not hear it as a story, because parents and children are, as it were, parts of one another. They are fully enmeshed, or often fully enmeshed. And the children, rather than hearing the story, they helplessly imagine what happened. And it is as if they experience it happening in the here and now, as the mother is telling the stories. Afterwards, as Grace showed, many times the children reacted with what we know as classic post-traumatic stress symptoms, including withdrawal, intrusive thinking, disturbed sleeping, and the feelings of bitterness to others in the social group. I will come back to this in my final point, after my final point. So this is the final point, the final pathway. Our findings also showed that not only can trauma be transmitted intergenerationally, but perhaps healing experiences of the mother in social therapy were also transmitted intergenerationally. The experience in social therapy had the effect of transforming mothers from only suffering victims, so from only the done to of collective violence, to full human beings. This is what they said in the storytelling booklet that Grace mentioned. They felt that they were human beings again, or they felt like they had been reborn. We conceive of this as that they were finally able to live an identity beyond the doer and the done to dynamic. In this new or reborn identity, or in this new experience of the self, they were able to start social relationships, and they were able to become emotionally caring mothers to their children. What the children said is that the mothers took an interest in their lives. They noticed when the children were withdrawn or silent, or when the children were not feeling well. They noticed the needs of the children, and using cultural way of caring, a Rwandan cultural way of caring, they also advised the children on, for example, complex social interactions. So we conceptualize this that as the attachment relationship became more secure, and this was as a result of the healing that the mothers experienced in social therapy, the mothers could support the children to take a full place in the social group, and that the children were freer to, for instance, do their studies and to develop in full adulthood, eventually, hopefully, forming families themselves. So I will stop here. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Grace and Marianne. It's just listening to the work again reminds me of the experience of reading the chapter, and how some of the excerpts that you include, that Grace read one to us, are, even as a reader, it opens up a whole world, and you feel as if you enter into it. They're very powerful. So I can just imagine what you are referring to when it's a story of a mother told to a child, and how they re-experience it as if it was their own, or as their own, and how those processes of talking and sharing can be very challenging, and they can bring up a lot. And then the hopefulness that also comes from the instances where there is the mother is able to deal with these histories and memories in a way that releases the children in some way, and creates that reconnection. So there's that hopeful element as well. So thank you so much. I'm now going to move on to our final presentation from Judy. And Judy has also been in connection with our unit for many years. And I can remember when you came to present your work with us, I think it was in 2016 at Stellenbosch University, together with your daughter who works in the same field. So we're very grateful for your contribution to the book, and also that you're here to speak to us today. So Judy is an emeritus professor at Southern Cross University, New South Wales, Australia, and patron of Wale, the NGO which offers culturally informed trauma integration healing approach training to individuals, family, community, and organizations. She is author of the book Trauma Trails, Recreating Songlines, the Transgenerational Effects of Trauma in Indigenous Australia. In retirement, Atkinson chooses to work on the ground with traumatized populations, particularly children and youth caught in the generational violence trauma vortex. And she is documenting the outcome of working within an Indigenous therapeutic framework in the ancient university. Judy, thank you so much for being here with us today. I'm going to hand over to you.
Well, thank you. I'm sitting here on Ridgeable Wable land, which is where I live, part of the Greater Bundjalung Nation, and I just want to recognise and honour and respect those who've gone before me. when I was first asked to put this chapter together, I had to reflect back to a time in my life when I was confronted by some very heavy issues around children. I was working in Cape York with the Aboriginal Coordinating Council, and there comes a time in your life when your life changes totally and completely. On the 18th September 1987 at 10 o'clock in the morning, an elder came to me and asked if she could talk to me that day. And that night she told me of the rape of a 5-year-old child. Now, she said nobody could do anything or would do anything. And as I investigated, I found that was exactly the case, that the government was not interested. There was no response to the needs of that child. And I've opened this discussion to bring an attention to something that's continuing. In 1987, at that time, we had the Royal Commission into Aboriginal Deaths in Custody between 1987 and 1991. And it highlighted a total control system program. And it documented how individual lives were psychologically crushed within these systems, the government files, removal of children. We have at this stage now, in this year, just this year alone, we've had another 6 deaths in custody. So not much has changed there. I'm going to quote from one of the files. All had files, every single person had files. Hundreds of pages of observation and moral and social judgments on them and their families. Officials recorded, they judged all, and yet knew nothing about them. Now, my daughter's PhD was working with men in prison, and it was the same kind of experience as she had, but more particularly what she found, their pathway to prison was what happened to them as children in the colonial state. So in the files, in the records, it says that Aboriginal people were removed at whim, crowded into settlements and missions and into impoverished camps. On cattle stations, perhaps, always there was non-Aboriginal people giving orders, making decisions. Aboriginal families were separated. Children removed if judged too light, and that's another issue I'll touch on shortly. And they were placed in homes or boarded out as servants to non-Aboriginal people. So that was part of the Royal Commission report from 1987 to 1991. Now, as we map the history, we see that Baker talks about a social dominance, and it was a cultural and spiritual genocide. And Professor Helen Milroy, who's just been a commissioner on a Royal Commission into institutional responses to child sexual assault, has said that all of the children had files. She served looking at sexual violence on Aboriginal children, and she again named it a cultural genocide. Salomon and Halloran talked about a cultural trauma. So there was a genocide and trauma kind of interacting with each other, and a total destruction of worldviews, Aboriginal worldviews, cultural worldviews. And it wasn't just in Australia. It in all colonized countries, from Alaska, the Navajos, Athabascan Indians, Hawaiian natives, Maori in New Zealand, and ourselves. All of those people had similar histories that needed to be looked at in an understanding of this colonization. And all of those groups had high rates of suicide, alcoholism, accidental deaths, intentional deaths, incarceration, high rates of incarceration, and just layers of loss, grief, and trauma. So I'll just take a sip. So all of these involved a mapping back across the history of this country, where at 1788, the prison hulk sailed into Sydney Cove and offloaded prisoners that had come out from England to make way for sheep to feed the woolen mills, moved off their land. Mud calls what we've been through historic trauma, a collective emotional and psychological injury in the life of individuals or a whole community. Now, what I've worked with over the years is children. I've been spending the last 10 years in a school with children who've been expelled or suspended from all other schools in the region. in that region, in the 1970s, it was illegal for Aboriginal kids to go to white schools. At that time, there had been a freedom ride into this particular town that I worked in. And they found that the swimming pool in the town was locked off to Aboriginal kids. So they opened the swimming pool. By mid, just excuse me, I don't know what's happening. So we'll just see if I can stop coughing. In that town, Aboriginal children were not allowed in school until in a white school until the mid-1970s. And then there was a decree by the Department of Education that principals, individual principals, could allow some Aboriginal children into their school if they decided that they were appropriate. So in this place where I've been working, 6 young boys between the ages of 13, 15 were allowed to come into the high school. Now I said that the swimming pool had been not available to Aboriginal young people. So on a Friday at that school, all of the kids would go down to the swimming pool, except for the 6 young boys, and they were made to stay back in the school and clean the schoolyards. So the racism existed at many different levels, and it continues in certain areas. The overrepresentation of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people in Australian prison continues. And in this year, we've had another 6 deaths in custody, what I wanted to highlight, however, was that I made a decision to work with Aboriginal women in prison. So I was invited to work for 5 years. I would go in every 6 months for 4 weeks and to work with Aboriginal women in Alice Springs Prison in Central Australia. Now, Aboriginal women in Australia make up 22% of the Australian population, and yet they provide 34% of women in prison. But in the Northern Territory, in Alice Springs, between 2004, when I first started to support the prison in 2014, the prison rate exceeded to a percentage of 440 increase of Aboriginal women in Alice Springs Prison. So I guess that I'm wanting to put that as a template of why I decided that it would be good to sit in prison with the women and do an educational program, I was asked to, that may help them think about what's been happening in their lives. We called the program the Kunga Stopping Violence. Kunga is the Aboriginal word for women in Central Australia. Kunga Stopping Violence program. Now, before I talk about that, I just want to say that at the beginning of this, I was sitting in a rehab with some Aboriginal women at the beginning of the Royal Commission, looking at deaths in custody. And we were also watching the celebrations on TV for Australia Day. And I was kind of thinking the world out there is quite crazy as I watched this. And these guys were from one of the communities where there had been 5 deaths in custody, 5 deaths in the watch house. And they were just sitting as though that they were not present in the room. They were zombed out. And I looked at them and I said, hey, why do you think your mates took their lives in the watch house in the community where they came from? And one of them looked back at me with these dead eyes and said, well, what is there to live for? So part of my desire to be in the prison with the women was to unpack that. What is it there to live for in their communities with their children and the things that are happening in their lives? So I went into the prison having received permission by the psychologists in the prison to run a 4-week workshop every 6 months, an educational program from 9 o'clock in the morning until 3 o'clock every afternoon when the prison closed down. I needed to get permission from the prison psychologists, and so therefore I had to build into what I was doing a sense of safety for the women to be in the room with me, They were all committed because, according to authorities, they'd committed crimes of violence, which was not true. We needed to look at self-care and self-reflection and critical conversations between the women as they came together. And I had a theory, and still have a theory base, that story is teacher, story is healer. And we would use art and poems and reflective discussion as we worked together. So to get this program through the prison authorities, I opened up with talking about the circle of well-being. And I used the words of Miriam Rosangama Borman, Daididi, and I'll just read them to you, the opening words that I had found, which became part of my PhD fieldwork as well. Daididi is a special quality, a unique gift of the Aboriginal people, inner deep listening and quiet, still awareness. Daididi recognises the deep spring that is inside us. It is something like what you call contemplation. The contemplative way of Daididi spreads over our whole life. It renews us and brings us peace. It makes us feel whole again. In our Aboriginal way, we learn to listen from our earliest times. We could not live good and useful lives unless we listened. So a major part of what we wanted to do was really listen to each other. Now, this year, Miriam Rosangama Borman has been made Australian Elder of the Year. And 2 days ago, I appeared with her on a talk fest where we talked to each other about how important the work that she's been doing in this teaching people to truly listen. So my desire when I went into the prison was have the women learn to listen to themselves and to listen to each other. And we created a kind of a ceremonial cultural healing in that process. We were lucky that we were given the education room. So we went over there every day. We used lots of art. And in the beginning, as the women came in with their heads down in shame, and I would ask how they were each morning, the standard word was good. And that was because they felt that was what they wanted. I wanted to hear them say good. Didn't matter how they were feeling, they had to say good. And some of the women were so shy that they could not lift their heads and they spoke in whispers. So in the first part of the work I did, we moved through 8 points of the circle of well-being: spirituality, environment, land and spirit, relationships, emotions, physical body, sexuality, stress, and that was about culture and family well-being. And then the final point of the circle was life purpose. Sexuality was a major issue. There was not one woman who had not experienced sexual violence. We did a lot of scrapbooking and music and art, and the women started to quietly reflect on deep inner hurt. And they would whisper it with their heads down as we sat together, particularly around their relationships, all of which were violent, and sexuality, and more particularly the loss of their children. All of the women over the 5 years I went into prison had their children removed. The second part of the program I did was anger, violence, boundaries and safety, because I had to do that to get it through the prison psychologists. Nonetheless, it was an important part of what the women went through, because they had committed acts of violence, generally when they were being violated themselves or when they were running from something. There was one woman who was in prison because she'd been driving a car without a license, and she'd got into this car to get away from a very severe beating. They were taught to start to think about the feelings that they had, and we had on the wall, we cut out a big, big tree, and we called it the violence non-violence tree. So every morning we'd come in and we would use words, and they would cut out leaves and put them on the tree, the beginning of finding feeling words for themselves. We started to look at their parenting and found that there was 3 to 4 generations of them not being parented themselves. All of their grandparents had come from sites of massacres. One of the last massacre in Australia was the Coniston massacre And every time I went in, I had women from that region. We talked about hot violence, including rage and cold violence, and how they could start to manage their anger. I'm sorry about this cough, I don't know what's happening. Within the first 3 times I ran the course in the prison, the women themselves decided that they would change the violence, non-violence tree on the wall. It was a massive big tree on the wall cut out in cardboard, to the feeling healing tree. And quite often, after 2 to 3 days of starting to think about what they were feeling, because they had no words for it previously, they were able to get up and put a flower on the tree, or a leaf on the tree. The leaf was when they had a really negative, angry feeling, but the flower was always when they started to name positive feelings. Now, the biggest teaching tool we had was their own stories. Story is teacher, story is healer. And I love Lewis Mel Madonna's words, stories contain and convey the meanings and the values of our lives, giving us cultural identity. We are our stories, we are embedded with stories. So the women's stories were often told with incredible simplicity. And often I would sit holding my breath as I listened to what they told us, which was not simple at all. There was deep complexity, but also incredible pain, which they had so often risen above. Working with the stories was really meaning making, and it was transformative, and it was highly political. The stories that are the teachers and the stories that are the healers allow us to circle into our own truth through these stories. So they started to see things that they hadn't, because they were just living on a day-to-day basis, they started to see that there was grave injustice in what they had been experiencing. The group work, we called them yarning circles. And the women would start the day with I feel, and by the 3rd day, they started to dig deeply into their feelings. I can remember one time a woman was called out, and she came back and she put her head down, and she never said anything for a while, but I knew something had happened. And then she started to write 5 things, and then she walked over and put them on the tree, and those 5 words showed me that something very important had just happened. And so I said quietly to her, so what's happened now? And she said, I've just been told that I'm being released. So she had 5 words, 3 of them were very positive, and the other 2 were that she was worried and anxious that what might happen to her when she left. This was a woman, by the way, that was in a very bad car accident when she was 2 years of age, to the extent that she'd had one of her legs removed. And she was highly ashamed that she had to wear an artificial leg when she was limping around, always wore long trousers because of her shame. She was in hospital as a 2-year-old for 3 years. And she never had a visitor from any one of her family because they were really remote. She was in Alice Springs Hospital, Adelaide Hospital, and Darwin Hospital. And she held a great deal of reserve about going back to her family. She finally went back to her family after she was released, and was promptly because she couldn't run raped. So there were stories within stories that contributed to who the women were. The 3rd unit that we ran, which became the most important unit, was the loss, grief, and trauma unit. The major things that came out from the women were their experiences as children, witnessing domestic violence, family and community violence, feeling unsafe, racist bullying at school, and as young women, sexual assault, moving into racist violence on the streets, and then moving into very early relationships where there was domestic or gender-based violence, or whatever you want to call it. They named all the women, fractured mother-child, family, community relationships. They could see how such patterns continued into their adult lives and into the lives of their own children. So we were now working with sometimes 4 generations. I was never in the prison without at least one baby on my hip, because mothers would give birth to babies until they were old enough to be removed. So we had a little baby in what we were doing over and over again. We would do all of the heavy work in the morning, and then in the afternoon we would cut and go out, and each woman would paint, and then I would go and sit beside the women, and I would just sit quietly and to see if they wanted to talk to me. The first time I went in there was a young woman who came in very distressed. She never said a word for the whole 4 weeks I was there. But when we set up the paintings, she just took a canvas and she started to paint intently, like just painting, focused on it. And it was exquisite. And as soon as she finished that one, she painted over the top of it and she painted another one. And she did 7 paintings. And I wanted to grab them because they were such incredible paintings. 5 years later, she came back, and this time she was talking and really animated, and she'd had a little baby by then as well, so we had that little baby there. And when she went to paint, and the painting is in the chapter, she sat there, and I sat beside her, and I said, "This is just beautiful. Tell me about these paintings. Tell me about them." And she was able to describe what the paintings meant. I said, "What happened when I first met you? You painted, but then you would paint over it." And she said, "You asked us to think about feelings, and I'd never thought about that before. So I just painted what I was feeling, and it was just bubbling inside me. And then I would paint over it really quickly because I had another feeling come up." So the 7 canvases were all these conglomerate of feelings that she'd only just understood that she could actually name and know and feel. During the paintings, one time there was a woman had fetal alcohol spectrum disorder, so she wasn't able to settle to paintings, but she loved music, and we always had music. And my computer came in a lot handy with that. And so she decided to be our DJ. That morning she had sat with me and she said, and she was inside because she'd driven away. She'd driven without a license away from a domestic, a violent episode with her ex-partner. And she was about to be released. And I'd said to her, "So what are you going to do when you get out? Are you just going to go back to the drinking with the fellas and get into trouble again?" And she said, "I can't change." And I said, "Okay, but have a think about what you're going to do." So we were busy with the rest of the activities, and she's on the music, and I heard this song, "Mistake, Mistake. We keep making the same mistakes again and again, running from the darkness. You can call it critical, but you keep making the same mistakes again and again." And I put my head up and I thought, she's just played that. And as I listened, she played it 20 times. So finally I walked over to her and I said, "Has this song got meaning for you?" And she said, "Yeah." She said, "You told me I can do something different. And I realized that I keep making the same mistakes again and again. So I need to think differently, don't I?" So yeah, music was a great way of talking to each other, of working with each other. These were rich educational experiences for me. My whole theory base on trauma changed. I realized that we could actually engage in deep education and it changed their lives. In fact, I'm still friends with most of the women over there. I've handed the packages over to Aboriginal women from Central Australia. I'm an Aboriginal woman from the East Coast. And so they're running it now, and it's had some very good results. What I wanted to think about was how we could map a 4-generational historic trauma with one woman, which included her grandmother's passed down terror of being chased by a white man on horseback. We had her great-grandmother's story, her grandmother's story, her mother's story, her story, and she was in prison. This woman was in prison because her 13-year-old daughter had been abducted and sexually assaulted. And she went looking for the father and she beat him up. Aboriginal women can be very strong at times. So she was sitting in prison waiting for her court case because she had been violent on the person who'd sexually assaulted her daughter. She decided that no matter what happened in the rest of her life, she would always protect her 4 girls. She had a 2-year-old, a 10-year-old and a 13-year-old who turned 14 when she was in prison. The tragedy of this, that both her husband and her, he went to the men's prison, which was just on the side where the women's prison was, and she went to the women's prison because her 13-year-old daughter had been abducted. They went looking for her, and they finally, 3 weeks later, found the man who'd abducted her daughter. And both the father and the mother gave the man a flogging. They beat him up for his bad behavior. They both were arrested and put in prison. And the 2-year-old, the 10-year-old, and the 13-year-old children were left to fend for themselves in town. I find that unbelievable. After we had run all of the stuff I've described to you for 3 years, we decided that the most important stuff that we could do was the loss, grief, victimization, and traumatization. So we brought that up to the front. And once we had done that for the first 2 weeks, we found that we had to do less work on the anger, violence, boundaries, and safety. Now, I want to finish by saying that Deakin University School of Law conducted an evaluation on site. The legal system is unjust to colonised, disempowered Aboriginal women, and understanding that we were using education and Indigenous critical pedagogy to contextualise the failure of law, health, social services across history. They said the course, and I'm quoting here, exists at the nexus of education, health, well-being, Indigenous pedagogy with an approach of drawing on Indigenous and non-Indigenous teaching, learning, healing in a unique way. Further, they said that not all trauma-informed policy and practice is attuned to the nuances of trans and intergeneration historic trauma on colonised peoples, Indigenous peoples. So I wanted to just finish by the Socratic method of introspection and reflection worked really well with the women. They learned deeply as they talked to each other and shared with each other. Of course, we showed Once Were Warriors, and they could dissect that movie better than I could. It's a Maori movie about domestic or family, extreme violence on women. And they had insight and they had wisdom more than most of the academics I've worked with. Once they shared with each other, they had insight and they could unpack what they'd been experiencing and how the system had failed them. So at the reconstructive post-apartheid, post-colonial interface, there is a tension. And sitting with those women in prison, presenting a curriculum that prison psychologists had passed, while using concepts from what Paulo Freire calls education for critical consciousness, education for freedom. The women's decisive understanding and their possible liberation came in the shared stories, generating dialogue and their paintings where they felt safe enough to critically reflect as they painted. They went into a deep meditation as they painted. And as I sat with them, they would quietly bring out their reflections of what had taken them to prison and the injustice they had experienced, but also that what they could do about it. Their paintings were beautiful. Their paintings were something that I sat with a deep reflection beside them. And one woman said to me at one stage, I've never painted like this before, but then I've never felt such deep grief like this before. So their paintings showed us what was happening inside them, and it was a very powerful tool for their healing. The women's behaviour in the course and its influence on me was the language of more than just survival. These women demonstrated a possibility for post-colonial redemption, and they inspired me. So I want to finish by saying that we're now in a negotiation with a Bachelor Institute, which is part of Charles Darwin University. Bachelor Institute is an education institute attached to the university that focuses on fully education that is aimed fully at an Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander cohort. So we now have a Masters of Indigenous Therapies, Healing Practices within the Bachelor Institute, and we will be skilling up a workforce that will be able to, an Aboriginal workforce that will be able to work on the ground in the way I've described to you. I'd like to finish. Thank you very much. I have no idea how long I talked for.
Thank you so much, Judy. I didn't want to stop you because those anecdotes are so powerful, and I'm so grateful for you coming to share them, because there's so much insight that lies in those stories that you share. And I want to encourage the audience now to post your questions. We don't have a lot of time. I think we've got about 15 minutes. So now's your chance to post your questions. And please do that on the chat. No, not on the chat function, on I think there are already some questions. So I would normally ask the panelists to first respond to each other, but I think because we're running short on time, it might be useful to jump straight into the Q&A, and then Melike, I'm sure, will give a chance for each of you to respond. And if there's something you really want to respond to in what each other have said, then you can take that opportunity as well. So Melike, I'm going to hand over to you now. Thanks.
Thank you, Kim, and thank you to our wonderful panelists. It was very emotional listening to all of you. I think the audience has been quiet because you literally transported all of us into your work and into this deep context that each of you live in and work in. And yeah, so I'm also grateful that we could listen to those stories. And I just want to apologize that our chat function wasn't working today, so no one actually had access to introduce themselves. So we will sort that out for next time. That's on us. Shari, so I want to go to you for our first question. Our panel members have been very good. They've already answered some of the questions, but I think it is nice to have some of you just respond to those questions in person as well. So I'm going to ask Shari to respond to Shepherd and Porfu. He said that he noticed that the photos appear after the burial. Who keeps them hidden? For what purposes are they hidden? And what does it mean for them to be revealed at their burial? Thank you, Shari.
Thanks, yes, and I'll try and keep it a short answer. But yeah, I mean, for me, I think that one of the things about the Kagoyire is there's still so much silence around it, and it's still considered a very fearful thing to draw attention to yourself by discussing it. And, you know, so many of these deaths were shocking and shameful, and the burials were shocking and shameful. You know, sometimes people were forced to contribute, to play a role in killing their own relatives, digging graves for their relatives, dancing on the graves of their relatives, or sometimes people were dragged up hills and then shoved in tiny crevices and then killed there, or shoved in ant bear holes, which is where you normally bury dogs. You know, there's so many things which are very degrading around the way that people were disposed of, and which means that people have not been able to undertake traditional rituals like amanzi and umbuyiso and so on, to honor the spirits of the dead and to help them to cross over and become part of the spirit hierarchy. Or just in any case, I mean, you know, I think in any culture, you don't want your relative buried like that. So the problem then becomes, how do you talk about that person? Because eventually somebody will say, and then what happened? And then you have to say, and then they were shockingly and humiliatingly murdered and buried in such a way that we can't honor them. So to avoid reaching that point, you simply don't talk about them. And in the meantime, they're coming to you in dreams, crying and saying, help us, you know, help us be at peace. And you don't know how to, okay, because people are afraid of the bones of the dead, especially if you're in a mass grave, because how do you extract your bones? If you're not a forensic anthropologist, how do you get your bones out of that grave and bury them properly? So the whole thing just becomes a situation which is unsolvable. And so that person gets disappeared from the family stories and from the family hierarchy. Families disappear their own dead in terms of memory. And it's only once that finally those bones, finally it's redressed, finally the bones are taken out of that terrible space, finally you can now bury them in an honored way in the right place with the right rituals and the right people. And as we know, what are funerals about? You don't talk about death at a funeral, you talk about life. You say, this is the kind of person your father was. This is what he did in his lifetime, and this is what he looked like. Okay, and so that's why the photos suddenly are produced, you know, in those contexts, because finally you're honoring your dead, and finally, therefore, the memories, the personhood is returned to the dead. And I'll just leave it there.
Thank you very much,
Wow.
Shari. I just want to say that we do have 10 minutes left, so we don't have to feel in that much of a hurry. Please do post your questions. You are here with experts today with such a wealth of knowledge in the different contexts that they work in. So please make use of this opportunity to still post your questions. So I'm going to go to Grace and Marianne. So Kate Jennings posted 2 questions. The one was already partly answered, but I'm going to just read it out again. So she asked, Grace, when you speak of healing, to what extent did this occur? Was it only in relation to the mother-child relationship, or did it bring a sense of healing to the mother as women victims in their own right? I think you also already spoke to this towards the end of your talk, but if you want to say something else about that. And then she had a longer question. She says, Mukazonga has written 2 memoirs on her experiences of loss, particularly of her mother as a result of the 1994 genocide. Because she lost most of her family in the genocide, there is a sense that she's using her books to create her own community with her readers as a means of having someone to mourn with and to speak to about her pain or grief. Can this be seen as a form of self-created sociotherapy? Her writing is so powerful that the reader can end up feeling a kind of secondary trauma, similar to how children end up feeling the emotions and experiences of their mothers. How does the reader work through their own sense of trauma or pain that is transmitted through Mukazonga's narrative? If writing is a form of sociotherapy, is it as effective as its spoken counterpart? Okay, so I'm going to leave it at that. Maybe Grace and Marianne, if the 2 of you both want to tackle those questions. Thank you.
Grace, will can you talk first about the mother's healing? Because you know the mothers very well. You've been following them for many years. So I have met them, thankfully, but maybe you can speak to that.
Yeah, let me first try to respond, then you can add on, because we all know those mothers, and I think Professor Annemiek is there. She can also, if she feels well, she can also add on. Yeah, actually, when the mothers joined social therapy, the intention was just to, I would say, in the area where we conducted our study, the objective was to see whether social therapy can help survivors, genocide survivors, because those ladies are from the most affected area in Rwanda. Social therapy had an objective to see whether social therapy can deal with the genocide consequences. Then, when women joined social therapy, they were first healed. They experienced healing through social therapy after sharing with other women of similar experiences, because they were in a group of women. Most of them were in the group of women who experienced the rape. They experienced the first hearing, and later on, that hearing enabled the ladies to also realize that through the change taken from the social therapy, experience from social therapy, there is something which changed in terms of their relationships and communication with their children. Then women who wrote the stories, and they kept sharing the contribution of social therapy in terms of healing and healing of their relationship with children. Then when we interviewed children, they also described same thing. They did not precisely say that the mothers were healed, but they focused much on the change in the mother. And that is where we found out that the healing of mother-child relationship was also important in the account of both women and both ladies and the children. And then we explored that further. I don't know whether Marianne can add on.
I think you explained very well, Grace. Actually, the sequence that from the healing that the mothers experienced in sociotherapy, they only began to notice that from the healing they also related differently in the family, and in fact some of the women actually felt deeply dismayed about how after they were healed, how they realized they had been as mothers before sociotherapy. So I think this sequence is more like that if one heals personally, although the mothers in our research healed in a social context, not in an individual therapeutic context, but in a social therapeutic context, that then can lead to other the healing of other relationships, and even just the having of other relationships. And I would like to link this a little bit with what Shari also said, is that and this was of course also in Professor Atkinson's presentation, is that for something to be talked, so healing, I personally believe healing cannot happen without a social sharing. So this in part goes to answer Kate Jennings' second question about the author. But that for social sharing to happen, you need a context. It doesn't just happen, you can't share just because something happened to you. The children wanted their mothers to share, the mothers sometimes wanted to, but I think a context needs to be created, and without that context, it's much harder. I won't say that it's impossible, but it's much more difficult. And I was struck by what Shari said, that the personhood was restored, and that echoes very much with what the mothers in our research said, that they felt like they became human beings again, and that from being human beings, they could have different social relationships, including the all-important one with their children. So Kate Jennings' second question about the writer of this story and her memoirs is an intriguing one. I haven't read the book. I don't know if Grace knows the book. But based on how she asked the question, I would say that it's important to have a social aspect to sharing. And writing, of course, people reading the book, that makes it more social, but it still feels very much alone somehow. But I don't know the work. So this is just my first attempt at an answer.
Thank you very much, Marianne. So if it's okay with the audience, I'm just going to let this run for maximum 3 to 5 minutes over time. So I have 2 final questions that I would like to pose to the panel. And Unison, it would be great if you can also include Kim, then she can also respond. If you can also drop her down so we can see her. So the first question is, let me just find it. Oh, apologies, now I lost my question. So I thought an intriguing question was from Samantha Stern. How can we better avoid centering ourselves as the practitioner, especially as white practitioners, in both the healing process and in the storytelling of the healing process? How can we better avoid taking on the rescuer identity? And then I just wanted to see if I can find the other question I had in mind. So Esther's question was, what are the main differences in the Western psychologists' help to heal trauma and the kinds of indigenous healing practices that your papers focus on? So those are two questions, and I want to ask as a final, to conclude our webinar, if you want to respond to either or both of those questions very briefly. So let's start with Judy, if that's okay.
I don't believe I know I would not be willing to work out there on the ground unless I felt that the people I was working with had the capacity to do their own healing. I'm not the healer, they're the healer. I'm just holding the space with them to find the stories. And over again, we would start with one story and it would go back across generations to the atrocities that happened, say, in the massacres and things that had happened in that region of Central Australia. But in all cases, the women individually, but more particularly collectively, I saw them. Within a week, they started to support each other and hold each other and share stories with each other in a way that, and they found solutions. The outcome of that was that when they were released from prison, they continued those connections. And I think that's an important point. For me, as an Aboriginal woman, I needed to know that for the time that I was with them for 4 weeks, that they would continue to use the skills they developed in that prison setting to engage more hopefully if they got their children back when they went back into their communities. So it's about me consciously with intent, giving them an opportunity to name and know and use the skills that I believed was inherent within them, but had been ignored by the system, the racist system that we live over under here. I'll just follow on and say that one of the problems we have, however, is a lot of the women are doing some pretty heavy work in the communities. They're the women that will go down to the school to help with the kids, but the work they do is not recognised. So we talk about a community of care on the ground in the roots of the tree, and up the top of the tree is what we call the communities of practice. They're the people who come in from outside, who've got the qualifications and have got the degrees, but they don't think to come down and sit on the ground with the women who are willing to work say in the school or in the childcare centre with the children. And we've been working to bring them together, the communities of practice and the communities of care together. Quite often the women on the ground know more about and have more power, but don't get paid for it, to do some of the deeper healing work than those who are brought into our remote communities who've got maybe a qualification as a social worker, as a psychologist or a teacher, but they don't have the deep cultural knowledge that they need to have to be able to survive in it. I'm talking our remote communities now, still very much embedded in culture, nor do they have the historic knowledge. The people coming in from outside don't have this historic knowledge. Our community women have the historic knowledge, but it's been the place of great pain and shame. And when they're given permission to find those stories and talk to each other about them, they blossom and they have a deep sense of power within themselves. And that's what we're working to do, to increase that capacity, to be their own therapists, healers, whatever we want to call it, change agents.
Thank you very much, Judy. Shari, is it okay if we go to you? You are muted.
Yes, sure. Okay. Well, I mean, it is, and of course, it's become a bigger issue over my career for myself, is the business of who owns narratives and who has a right to define, you know, what is trauma and what is healing, you know, those sorts of things. And so for me, increasingly, you know, I feel that the language I speak is the language of the bones, basically, you know, in terms of, you know, that is now my role, is to listen very carefully to what the living are saying about the dead and what happened to them and who they were and how tall they were and how old they were and what they were wearing and, you know, all of those things. And then to help the bones to bear witness and to have a voice. And there I support Clyde Snow, who always said bones make the best witnesses. They speak very softly, but they never lie and they never forget. So my role is just to listen to those whispers and to see if they are lining up with the memories of the living. But for me, one of my big problems is that we're losing our eyewitnesses with the passage of time. You know, those who knew the dead best are usually spouses, parents, which we've almost run out of. And now we still have some siblings, we still have children. But if you were very young, you may not remember how old was your father, what was he wearing on the day he died, those sorts of things. And these can be very important in terms of returning personhood in due course. So I feel that we're really racing against time now, because the dead speak best when they're resonating against the memories of the living. I also don't want to make it simple. You know, exhumations are not this magic bullet that heals everything. It can be very traumatic, you know, you remember someone you loved and now you see them and they're literally a pile of old bones. You know, and there's trauma attached to that. And we work for a very long time with families. But having said that, I do think that the reburials are always joyous events. They're always so filled with intense emotions, sadness, but also relief and a sense of having, you know, managed to do something that, which is very important in terms of the family healing and moving on. So, I mean, look, I don't think there are any bullets. I think that, you know, the thing about trauma is it happens so quickly. You know, soldiers can move into a village and the damage they do in one day, you're still healing 3 generations later. And it's not simple, you know, and that's just the tragedy of state violence.
Thank you very much, Shari. Grace, is it okay if we go to you if you want to respond to any of those questions, or if you just have a closing remark in response to your panelists?
Thank you, Maliki. I think time is almost over. I don't know how much I can say. How much time do we still have?
Very little.
You added like a few minutes, but okay. What shall I add? I think Professor Annemiek added something. She talked about that. She said that also women benefited from the sharing of their life histories, because listening to them while sharing their stories also was contribute to the hearing, but also the focus group, additional focus group discussions we have with the ladies. But if there is any other question I can respond, please, would you please remind me? Did I miss?
Thank you, Grace. I think the questions that we are thinking about were, you know, how these more alternative kinds of healing differ from traditional Western kinds of healing, and also your position as the. But you don't have to feel forced. I just wanted to.
No, it's okay. Yeah, what I can say is that the social therapy intervention has been contextualized, and the group is facilitated by Rwandans, local Rwandans who are trained in the approach, and they speak the same language as the community members. And that the manual or the social therapy, the manual has been developed by the first trained social therapist, so it is contextualized. in that case, we are not, though there are some skills that are borrowed from the Western approaches, but we try to make it culturally perceived. So it is the discussions are facilitated in a natural way. You know, there are principles and the phases that are brought from the Western culture, but discussions are facilitated by local people and local language, and the people have, what do I say, they can, yeah. It has been contextualized and we add and revise and, you know, so the approach is contextualized in the context of Rwanda.
Okay. Thank you very much, Grace. Marianne, a last word from you.
Let me hook in on what Grace said. When I first came in contact with sociotherapy, it had already been going in Rwanda for quite some time. What people may not know is that sociotherapy is not a trauma therapy. So eventually people talk about memories, but it is quite late into the process. And that very early into the process, people work through phases, giving local interpretations or local definitions, maybe even, or experiential definitions of what Grace called Western concepts, but of course I think they're also maybe human concepts. So people talk about care and trust and safety. So they give local cultural content to these concepts, and that's what they talk about. So they don't actually talk about trauma actually at all until quite late in the process, and then they talk about memories, and of course the memories that come up are very often the memories of trauma. So that would be where I see it as a challenge to the more conventional trauma therapy, which is to talk about the trauma, and actually here they talk about life, and they get to know each other again as human beings, and that is what actually, you know, we've talked about this amongst ourselves much, and we will write about it more. But my growing conviction is that it's meeting people as human beings again that is in the end the portal to healing. And then I would like to, I know we're very late, but let me just say two additional things. I think this is also speaks to one of the questions, I can't remember now who said it and I can't find it, how we as Western therapists can center ourselves and not want to focus too much on rescuing. And I think anybody who's worked with trauma or talked to traumatized people has been there, whether in research or in a therapeutic context. But I mean, when I pull myself back, I think rescue from what? I mean, the experiences are the experience, and that if there is any therapeutic or healing effect, it comes from sharing and not necessarily from rescuing. And the very last thing I want to say is, I can't remember now who, I think it was Shari, but I can't remember who, talked about dreaming, about how the people are present in dreams. And that can be, for therapists, a good way to hear different parts of the story, is maybe to talk about dreams. But that's a longer discussion, but I just wanted to mention it.
Thank you very much, Marianne. That was beautiful, the way you described that process. Kim, we are very overdue, but I want to give you the final word. Thank you.
I just have two final words. The one is deep respect for the work that you all do, both as practitioners and as scholars, and bring it into the scholarship, because I think it brings something very unique to the scholarship itself. And gratitude for being here and the opportunity to hear about your work in such a tangible way and to learn from the insights that you've shared here so generously. Thanks, Melike.
Okay, so that was a wonderful seminar. You left us with a lot to chew on. We have the questions that we'll think and that we'll circulate amongst the panelists. Thank you very much to all of you for a wonderful webinar and for sharing this deep emotional work that must surely be very taxing on each of you individually as well. I just want to put out the reminder there for our two upcoming events. So our next webinar is on the 9th of June. And then also please remember that on the 27th of May, there is the Africa Day event, where Phumla Madikizela will be in conversation with Tsitsi Dangaremga, the multi-award winning author of This Mournable Body. And the event is titled Remaining Human, Dignity and Repair in the Face of Violence and Trauma. So with that, we hope to see all of you back soon. Thank you very much.